is 8.2 trillion. External debt service is 7.6. So that brings the total to 15.896. So the budget also has a line for sinking fund. The sinking fund was created way back from 2018. That's where we pay promissory notes from. We know that the National Assembly over many years has approved promissory notes, and some were recently approved. So for those ones, money is provided from in the budget so that when they mature, we pay for it. So what is provided there is 430 billion naira for 2025. So that's what the proposal is. If I may just preempt you, somebody want to say, why was it the debt service 8.2 in 2024 and is 16.3 in 2025? The reasons are twofold. In 2024, we borrowed a lot more. We took World Bank loans. We raised 5.7 trillion naira in the local market. We also took a Eurobond. So those as we borrow more, debt service grows. Okay, so that's, and then the second thing is that interest rates now are much higher. So we used to borrow locally when we issue sukuk, maybe at 15, 16%. Now rates are over 20% because of monetary policy action. So those are the reasons for the higher figures. Because as we borrow, it adds on to the stock and you have to service it. And as the DMO likes to say, when we borrow, we create an obligation. It's not a grant. When it's a grant, it is take it and you don't have to repay. So that's the reason for the debt service that is there. So we're also asked, what's the debt repayment strategy? Basically, we do some liability management activities as a DMO, so that what we like to say when newspapers comment, yes, debt stock is, depending on the period, 121, 134, 140 from the September ones. Not all of it is due now. We're not going to pay all of it now. So we spread them out so that they're not all due in one day. But again, as a country, we have been very disciplined to provide that service in the budget. Okay? So it's not that when it is due, we start looking for approval. It's been approved, so payment can be made, and then there will be no default. Because when we don't default, then we can borrow more. The new borrowing in the 2024, this is again status, Appropriation Act was 6 trillion naira for domestic and about 1.8 trillion for external, which takes it to 7.8. So I'm speaking to the one that we raised commercially, to 7.8 trillion naira. As we speak, we have raised over 96% of that. For the 1.78 that was external, with your support and the entire National Assembly, we were able to get approvals last year in December, end of November, I think, and we issued that 2.2 billion naira, Eurobond, $1 billion, meaning that was 100% achieved. For domestic, there's only 350 billion naira remaining, and that's because 300 billion is for sukuk, so you see another sukuk within the first half of this year, and then 50 billion for green bonds. As you know, Nigeria is part of all the climate initiatives, the conference of parties that happens in Dubai. I think there was one in Brazil recently. So we'll issue green bonds as well, you know, to sustain Nigeria's commitments and participations in all of those committees. So there's only 350 billion. Like I said, we performed in terms of new borrowing over 96% by year end, December 2024. So for 2025, again, this is under consideration, it's in the budget before the National Assembly. In Table 5, we'll see that there's privatization proceeds of 312 billion, borrowings from multilaterals and bilaterals, 3.7. Those are those World Bank loans and the ones we get from countries, other countries, China, Japan, France, those ones. And then the new borrowings, 9.276 trillion. Okay, so those are the ones that the DMO goes out. You see us issue sukuk, treasury bills, savings bond for individuals to invest in, and then we do Eurobonds. So if we go to Table 6, we will see that breakdown, how the 9 billion is broken down. So you can see for external, we have 1.8, which is similar to last year, meaning another $2.2 billion, and then 7.4 trillion naira Last year it was 6 trillion. The previous year it was 7 trillion. Now we're back to 7 trillion. Okay, so that's what it is. So for the domestic borrowing, once you approve the budget and the president signs, you will see that we start borrowing. But for the external, we come back to you like we did in November last year, because the DMO Act says you have to give us a resolution approving the terms and conditions. So what are the plans? The business the DMO does is to raise funds for the government based on the budget or any other approvals that we get. The second business, of course, is to manage the public debt. And I think over the years, the institution has done well in that. After we exited the Paris Club in 2005, 2006, as a country, we have serviced our debt, which is why we can still be borrowing. We know that there are countries that can't borrow again because they have defaulted recently, and a number are in Africa. So to that extent, the country has done well, and like I said, the institution has done well. For domestic borrowing, what we usually say is what we borrow in the market. Every quarter or every week or every month, you will see a DMO advert in the paper. We're offering FGN bonds. We're offering treasury bills. When it's time for Sukuk, you will see Sukuk. When it's time for green bonds, you will see it. So that's how we raise the money for the government. Each product is for different tenors, and it appeals to different investors. So some are for pension funds, some are for banks. Either way, we put all of the money together and pass it to the Office of the Accountant General. Between that office and the Ministry of Finance, that's where appropriation is done. Okay? That's where the access to the Consolidated Revenue Fund and the Capital Development Fund are. So our job ends when that money goes. So for external borrowing, after COVID, actually when COVID happened and it became difficult to borrow externally, we started looking at, apart from Eurobonds, what else, how else can we raise monies? So we looked at loans from banks, we looked at export credit agencies. I'm sure we're all familiar with the Chinese Export Credit Agency. There's also the United States Export Credit Agency. What it is they can give you money slightly cheaper, and it will be tied to a project. You don't just take it and then, expend it as such. So we get monies. What we do is to say, let's start with the cheaper ones if we can get them. If not, we then end up with commercial, which is where Eurobonds come from. So that's the plan for raising the money. So we'll come back to you after the budget has been signed into law for the external component. And I think having done the other one in December, there's comfort around, okay, Eurobonds work. We started issuing Eurobonds in 2011. So this time, there'll be probably a bit more time to process the approval. So we'll come again to you. Again, it goes through the minister to FEC, and then it comes from the president to the National Assembly. So again, like I said, it's based on the budget. So while we work with figures and we talk about borrowing and debt service, we actually have a medium-term debt management strategy. So when you say go and borrow, when I say go and borrow, when the budget is signed into law, it's a mandate to go and raise the funds. What we do, we have a strategy every 4 years that tells us how will we raise the money. Will we borrow for 5 years or 3 years? Will we do Sukuk? Will we do FGN bonds? Which one is good for government? So there's a strategy that guides that, and it has targets. So some of you may have had debt to GDP ratio of 40%. That is very popular. Okay, it's coming from that strategy. So with that strategy, we benchmark how we're doing. So that document is being updated now for the new MTEF. The source of data is MTEF and other agencies like Central Bank, the National Bureau of Statistics. So it's been updated. When it's updated, that's on page 4. We will submit it. We also have a debt sustainability analysis. These are World Bank templates, and we work with them to develop it. So the debt sustainability analysis, and we have 2 experts here at least, in fact, all these 3 people here. We try to say, looking into the future, given where we are today, export revenues, crude oil production, right? All those things you look at, interest rates, exchange rates. Over the next 10 years, can we service our debt. That's what sustainable is. Can we service our debt without being choked or without having to borrow at very expensive rates because you are desperate? Okay, again, that will be updated with the new MTEF. MTEF is a source document for us because that's where the projections are, the figures, GDP growth and all of that. So when those have been updated and processed for approval, we'll make them available. But let me quickly say one of the points the DMO has been making. Let me just use this opportunity to say we've been advocating for a number of years for revenue growth because if we look at the budgets, successive budgets, we basically have an expenditure, some revenue component, and the difference is all borrowing. That's why debt stock has grown. That's why debt service has grown and is growing. So we are advocates for revenues. We are also advocates for PPPs. And if there are things that, instead of borrowing, can we work with the private sector to get something done so that we don't have to keep borrowing. Instead, we get revenues from those. So we have presented this before to our committees, as well as when public hearings are held, when DMO is invited to make presentations. We've made those presentations. Let's look at revenues, let's look at privatization, let's look at PPPs, so that the level of borrowing can be lower, revenues are higher, and debt will be sustainable. Nigerians won't be worried. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. But put number above, we say first 5 questions, then you respond, then we continue as the case may be. So, any questions or observation, please?
What is the total debt of the country? Because we are only talking about the servicing of the debt. The principal amount
Yes.
is not stated here. That's what my question.
Affects economic growth. That is true, but not always a straight line. And I say that some countries have been in recession and are just coming out because of a number of factors: COVID, Russia, Ukraine. Otherwise, those were countries that were growing, even with large debt. So I agree, we shouldn't allow the debt stock to keep growing. And DMO has said this very publicly at the National Assembly and at meetings internally and to its supervisory board as well. We can't just keep borrowing. You know, you prepare the budget, you get the deficit, you hit it with borrowing. No, we've made that point. So we agree with you on that. But I just wanted to present some figures as well from other countries. These are World Bank data. So if you look at some of the advanced countries, and these are not figures of, not last year's figures, because they haven't published those ones. The debt to GDP ratios of countries like Canada, like Germany, the US, if you come to Africa and look at Canada and even, Kenya and South Africa, they are way higher than Nigeria's. Some are over 100%, okay? But nobody is calling them distressed. And the reason is that point about revenue. So, and that they have been growing. Okay, but when you look at their revenue ratios, their revenues to GDP, Kenya, that is not so far from us with the same rating, is 15%. South Africa is about 18%. At that time, we were battling with 9%. Okay, is that component that we are missing? Revenues must grow. Borrow for infrastructure to create jobs, growth, but on the other side, you have to be growing revenues. So that's the picture of those countries. Their revenues to GDP are higher. And I believe those are, that's one of the initiatives His Excellency the President has put into place. I believe the target for the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Reforms and Tax Policies to get that ratio up to 18%. Have we crossed 10 slightly? Yes, we're at 10%. That's the mandate, to go to 18% and then get to 25% at some point. So revenues are very key for debt, okay, apart from growth for debt. We missed the figure on debt, but it's actually published quarterly, but I read it. Sorry, we didn't include it here. So we just published the debt stock as at September 30th. So we reconcile the figures with Central Bank Accountant General. So by the time we publish, you know that they've been reconciled and they are accurate. Because they are our payment agents, they receive our monies and they also process the debt service. So as at September 30th, the debt stock in Naira terms was 142 trillion Naira. So that includes the federal government, the 36 states, and the Federal Capital Territory. But I also like to add that when you put all the 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory together, they account for only about 10% of that figure. So it means we should be looking at each other here and know that we own most of Nigeria's public debt, okay? So it's on our website, but it's 142 trillion Naira as at September 30th. In US dollar terms, it is $88.89 billion. So for December, it will certainly be higher because there's a 2.2 billion euro bonds that we issued. There was also a disbursement by the World Bank. You know, you approved 1.5 billion US dollars. So 750 was disbursed in Q4. So that's how the figures increase. They come from those borrowing activities. Am I correct? You got 750 in November. Mm-hmm. So to be higher, but this is what it is now. And this figure is in the public space. So that's for advising government. The DMO does that. It's part of our work on debt sustainability. In fact, in recent times, he has chaired, so a committee prepares the debt sustainability report. We've had to move away from just using that World Bank template to include a section that looks at, apart from these templates, what is our own reality? How much revenues are we really generating? What are the constraints? So we've added those and actually went as far as advising the budget office some years back. Can you please prepare a revenue-based budget as opposed to, you know, a big budget, small revenue, and big borrowing? If we go back 3 years ago, I think, the total budget was 21 trillion Naira. 10 trillion out of that one was new borrowing. So these are real figures. I think in the course of this year, last year there was a lot happening. We'll be able to talk a lot more about how borrowing affects debt service, affects several other things, and what to do. We will have that time to do that. So I've advised them. The questions you asked, sir, on there's already a committee on fiscal reforms and tax policy, so I think they're doing a good job there. The issues around PPPs, the government has been trying to address it and is still addressing it. At some point with the previous administration, it was like when investors are coming, whether domestic or international, they want to be sure what are the procedures, what are the rules, what do I need to do? And they don't want to go from one office to the other or one agency to the other, and 1 year they're still shopping around. So there was a circular issued that I think vested those powers with the Bureau of Public Enterprises. Go there and you get the information. Second point, which I know the government is working on also, if somebody is coming for PPP, not only should the process and the institutions concerned be clear, but surely you should package those projects for them to see and say they're interested in it. Then they can ask questions and take it. But those are beyond our remit, but we'll talk about it. Distinguished Senator Abiru asked about debt service. You're right, so debt service to revenue ratio for January to September is 61.99%.
Any more question or observation? Okay.
Now, the reason why you are borrowing is because your cash ratio to GDP was poor when the government came in, which I had the Central Bank last week here, that it was currently now we have cash ratio to GDP of 1.5%. But what was handed over to this government was a cash ratio to GDP of 0.75%. And there is no way you can have 1% cash to your assets, total assets, and manage the economy very well. So the government has done well by increasing to 1.5% cash to GDP, and that's why the money supply increased. And that's the reason why you are borrowing. And as Senator Abreu said, the real issue here is your debt servicing ratio. And again, your debt servicing ratio has come down. So we no longer use 92% to service our loans. But now, through your effort and that of government, it has come down to about 68%, and the government must be applauded for that. And that's the point that Senator Abreu is making. So we at the Senate, we know all this. And when these figures are coming, we expect justification and see where you are actually having issues. So we do know, we are managers of various diverse interests here, that GDP is the total asset of the company, the total activities of buying and selling in the whole economy. That is your value. So if you have 1% of that value in cash, it will be difficult for you to manage the economy. That is the situation in which the president found himself when he was sworn in. But despite the fact that the cash ratio was 0.75%, it has increased as of today to 1.5%. And that is where the revenue to debt ratio is now becoming more interesting. And I think that those are the submissions that should be on the premise of your introduction. Thank you.
We're all aware that every nation in the world borrows. The United States of America, in 2008, when the global recession hit, they borrowed over 880-something billion to cushion the economy and bring it back to its standing. However, one of the things that we have noticed that is quite prevalent all this while that we've been holding sessions with government agencies is that their recurrent expenditure always takes absolute precedence. And then when you check their capital, you find out that the capital is barely 20–30% of what that recurrent is, personnel and overhead. My question to you, as someone who I believe is also an economist, will this country ever develop substantially if capital projects that is supposed to generate activities that will stir the economy, provide employment, have strengthened the private sector, strengthen our economy by way of strengthening our currency? If we continue to spend more on personnel, recurrent expenditure, salaries, and less on capital, will we ever grow? Thank you very much.
Capital component of the budget at 30%. So I think the challenge is revenue. Your payroll, there are some things that the former DG of the budget office said they are fixed. Your payroll is there, you have to pay the people you've employed, the statutory transfers have to go. So what is remaining? So I think the challenge is still revenue. You need revenues to cover your recurrent.
Which also points.
It's revenues.
Which also explains what you said earlier, that the DMO had advised the executive to find ways to intensify and strengthen our domestically generated resources, revenue, to be able to cushion that vacuum that I believe production. That is the only way this country can grow. Production. In an economy, in a country that we have consumed is imported, I don't see us making progress. So we are still encouraging our people. In the 60s, we were far better off. We were producing, and we were producing everything literally in industrial scale. Today, we are now a consuming nation. So I want to use this opportunity to appeal to all the members of the executive, from the federal to the local government. Let us encourage PPP, bring in the private sector so that we can boost our economy drastically. Thank you.